They called him the Feral One. When the invaders came, he was the only thing standing between his people and extinction. The jungle does not care what you are. It does not care that your spine is wrong for climbing, that your fingers were made for tools and keyboards, and holding other human hands rather than gripping bark at 60 feet. It does not care that your skin tears instead of sheds, that you cannot run on all fours, that you sweat salt instead of secreting venom, that your eyes are weak in the dark. The jungle does not care about any of this. It will kill you the same as everything else, slowly or quickly, depending on your luck. Cale Marin had no luck. He had something better. He had 18 years of the jungle in his blood. The colony ship Covenant's Hope went down on the night of the Dreven first pass. No one called it a crash. A crash implies accident, implies weather or mechanical failure or human error. What happened to the Covenant's Hope was a targeting solution executed with the cold precision of a species that had been making war on smaller civilizations for 4,000 years. The Dreven pulse beam hit the ship's engine cluster at 0300 hours local time, and the Covenant's Hope came apart in 3 sections over the forest canopy of Verdant 7, a colonization world that the Terran Expansion Authority had designated as habitable, but not yet formally settled. 312 colonists were aboard. 41 survived the initial impact. By morning, the jungle had taken 11 more. The Dreven took the remaining 30 when they swept the crash site at dawn, all of them except 2. A man named Dr. Joran Marin and his wife Sarah, who had run in the wrong direction, or the right direction depending on how you measured survival. They ran into the deep forest, where the Dreven sensor drones couldn't penetrate the electromagnetic interference generated by the indigenous flora, and they kept running until they could not run anymore. They built something in the trees. Joran had been an engineer before he was a colonist. He understood load-bearing and tension, and the particular mathematics of structures that needed to withstand both weather and the grief of people who had lost everything. The treehouse he built over the following weeks was crooked and impractical and held together in places with braided vine and salvaged conduit from the wreckage. And it was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever seen. Their son was born 8 months after the crash. They named him Cale. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw and a laugh that sounded, Sarah always said, like something the jungle itself had decided to make. Cale was 14 months old when the Dreven returned to the crash site in force. Joran heard the sensor drones before Sarah did. Engineers hear differently, hear the frequencies of machines, and he had just enough time to hide the baby in the secondary crawl space above the water collection basin before the patrol found the treehouse. The Dreven were thorough. They were always thorough. Cale was too young to remember the sound his father made. He was told about it later, much later, by the ones who found him. The Varric were not human. This needs to be said plainly, because humans have a habit of projecting themselves onto anything warm-blooded and approximately mammalian, and the Varric were neither warm-blooded nor mammalian, and bore approximately 0 resemblance to anything that had ever evolved on Earth. They were large. The adults stood between 8 and 10 feet, and they moved on 6 limbs in a rolling, undulating gait that was simultaneously graceful and deeply unsettling to watch. Their skin was banded, rust red and deep brown, layered in overlapping plates that flexed like armor when they moved. Their faces were flat, wide-set, with 4 optical clusters that could function independently or in concert, and they communicated through a combination of subsonic chest resonance and high-frequency clicks that humans could feel more than hear. They were also, as a species, the most intensely territorial beings Cale had ever encountered, which made them, in his estimation, perfectly reasonable. He understood territory. Karak-Han found the infant on the 3rd day of searching the crash site's secondary perimeter. She had been tracking a scout drone signal into the deep forest when she detected the biochemical signature of a mammalian life form in the sealed compartment. Body heat, respiratory gases, the specific chemical signature of infant distress. She opened the compartment expecting to find some injured forest creature. What she found was a human child, approximately 1 standard year of age, who looked at her with enormous dark eyes and did not cry. Most organisms encountering a Varric adult for the first time reacted with what Cale would later describe, in the flat vocabulary he'd assembled from his parents' salvaged language files, as significant biological distress. The infant looked at Karak-Han's wide, banded face and the 4 optical clusters blinking in sequence, and reached out one small hand and touched the nearest plate of her shoulder armor. Karak-Han, who had lost her own infant to the Dreven bombardment of the southern rookery 11 cycles prior, made a decision that her tribe mates would debate for years. She kept him. The Varric did not have a word for adoption. They had a word that roughly translated as claims kin-bonded survivor, which carried the full legal and social weight of blood relation in their culture, and which had historically been used only for Varrock orphans taken in by other Varrock families after territorial conflicts. Karakhan used it for Kael in front of the full Elder Assembly, and Tarakhan, her bondmate and the current voice of the Dusk Territory clan, looked at the squirming human infant and said, in the low subsonic resonance that meant he was choosing his words for the formal record, that the child was thin and slow and would need watching. Karakhan said that she understood this. Tarakhan said that the other territories would talk. Karakhan said that she had never cared particularly what the other territories said about anything, and furthermore, that the child had a grip like a thorn root, and she would like to see anyone try to pry him loose. The assembly ratified the kin claim. Kael did not understand any of this at the time, being 13 months old and deeply interested in the texture of Karakhan's shoulder plates, but the record existed. And later, when the politics of it mattered, it would matter that the record existed. He grew up strange. The Varrock young developed slowly compared to most predatory species on Verdant 7, but they developed predictably. Standard milestones for motor development, communication, territorial awareness, the particular instinctual skills that every Varrock child was supposed to acquire in sequence. Kael developed differently. He could not do things that Varrock children did effortlessly, and he could do things that Varrock children could not do at all. And the gap between these two realities was the landscape of his childhood. He could not run on 6 limbs. His body would not bend that way. But he could climb vertically in a way that no Varrock his age could match. His smaller body, his different center of gravity, the way his hands and feet worked together with a prehensile precision that the broad Varrock feet couldn't replicate. He could not echolocate, but he had a visual acuity that operated well in conditions that left even adult Varrock temporarily blind. Overcast days, high scatter light environments, the specific green-gray dusk of the deep forest canopy. He could not speak in Varrock subsonic resonance because his chest cavity was the wrong shape, but he could produce a passable acoustic mimicry of the high-frequency click patterns, and he had assembled from his parents' language files a working model of Varrock formal and informal speech that no one else in the territory possessed, because no one else in the territory had spent 3 years old enough to read but young enough to have nothing better to do than study. He also made tools that the Varrock found baffling. This was the thing that unsettled Tarakhan most. Not the climbing, not the strange visual capabilities, not the clicking that wasn't quite right, but was close enough to be understood. What unsettled Tarakhan was watching a 9-year-old human child look at a problem. A water collection system that wasn't working, a damaged shelter panel, a trap that kept failing, and then build something. Not instinctively, not through the accumulated behavioral programming that shaped Varrock problem-solving. Deliberately. Kael would sit with the problem for a while, sometimes a long while, making the small rhythmic sound that Tarakhan had eventually identified as thinking music, and then he would begin gathering components and assembling something that no one had described to him, something he had arrived at through a process that Tarakhan, try as he might, could not fully map. He asked Karakhan about it once. She said, "He comes from building people." Tarakhan said, "We all build." Karakhan said, "Not like this. We build what we remember." He builds what he imagines. Tarakhan watched the 9-year-old reassemble a water trap with 3 modifications that improved its yield by 40%, and decided that the conversation was above his current capacity to resolve satisfactorily, and went to do something else. The hardest year was the 12th. Kael had known for some time that he was different. The Varrock were not a species that lied to their young about uncomfortable realities. Their communication system didn't have the grammatical structures for sustained, comfortable fiction, and so the fact of his human origin had been explained to him at an age when he was old enough to understand it and young enough to absorb it without it breaking something essential. He was human. His parents had been human. They were gone. He was here. He was kin claim Varrock. Both things were true simultaneously, and the tension between them was simply the shape of his life. But at 12, the gap widened. The Varrock young went through a developmental phase called the hardening, roughly equivalent in social function to human adolescence, but distinguished primarily by a sudden and dramatic increase in physical capability, territorial instinct, and the willingness to fight other Varrock young for status and position within the emerging adult hierarchy. The hardening was not optional. Every Varrock who survived it came out the other side with a place in the social order, earned through demonstrated capability. Kael could not harden, not the way they did. He could not grow the secondary dorsal plates. He could not produce the infrasonic challenge cry. He could not match the sudden growth in mass and reach that his agemates were accumulating, seemingly overnight. What he could do was refuse to lose. This distinction matters. There is a difference between winning and refusing to lose. Winning requires possessing the tools for victory. Refusing to lose requires only the decision that you will not, under any circumstances available to you, stop. Kale had been making that decision for 12 years in a body that was not designed for this jungle and a society that had no template for what he was. And by the time the hardening pushed his agamates into formal challenge fights, the decision had become something deeper than conscious choice. It was the architecture of him. His primary agamate rival was a young Varric named Bar, who had grown through the hardening into a specimen of such physical excellence that the Elder Assembly had begun using him as a benchmark for the cohort. Bar was broader, stronger, faster on 6 limbs, capable of the full challenge cry at volume, and possessed of the particular Varric certainty that physical superiority was simply a description of the world rather than a thing that could be argued with. The first time Bar came after Kale in formal challenge, in front of the cohort, in the clearing near the third water source, with 3 elder observers making notes, Bar was considerably larger, fully hardened, and operated under the reasonable assumption that this would be brief. Kale used every advantage he had. He climbed things that Bar couldn't follow. He moved in 3-dimensional space while Bar was anchored to the ground plane. He used the overcast light that left Bar's superior optical clusters momentarily uncertain. He used tools, 2 carefully chosen branches deployed as leverage points, in ways that no Varric challenger had ever thought to use them, because no Varric challenger had ever needed to. He did not win. Bar caught him eventually. The weight differential was simply too great. And when Kale was pinned under 600 pounds of hardened young Varric, he was aware of the traditional moment where the defeated party made the submission gesture and the challenge ended with everyone's dignity more or less intact. He did not make the submission gesture. He bit Bar's foreleg instead. There was a very long silence in the clearing. Bar released him, partly out of shock and partly because human teeth, it turned out, could find gaps between Varric plates that Varric teeth could not. The elder observers made notes. Kale stood up, bleeding from 4 different places, and looked at Bar, and the look on his face was not defiance or aggression or any of the standard expressions the Varric had categories for. It was just patience. The patient look of someone who has decided that this isn't over and is not particularly concerned about how long it takes. One of the elder observers, a senior Varric named Kal, who was 400 years old and had seen things that made most current events feel like minor footnotes, resonated a single low note that meant, in context, interesting. She did not explain what she found interesting. She made a note and moved on, but she remembered. The hardest year was the 12th. Kale had known for some time that he was different. The Varric were not a species that lied to their young about uncomfortable realities. Their communication system didn't have the grammatical structures for sustained comfortable fiction, and so the fact of his human origin had been explained to him at an age when he was old enough to understand it and young enough to absorb it without it breaking something essential. He was human. His parents had been human. They were gone. He was here. He was kin-claimed Varric. Both things were true simultaneously, and the tension between them was simply the shape of his life. But at 12, the gap widened. The Varric young went through a developmental phase called the hardening, roughly equivalent in social function to human adolescence, but distinguished primarily by a sudden and dramatic increase in physical capability, territorial instinct, and the willingness to fight other Varric young for status and position within the emerging adult hierarchy. The hardening was not optional. Every Varric who survived it came out the other side with a place in the social order, earned through demonstrated capability. Kale could not harden. Not the way they did. He could not grow the secondary dorsal plates. He could not produce the infrasonic challenge cry. He could not match the sudden growth in mass and reach that his agamates were accumulating seemingly overnight. What he could do was refuse to lose. This distinction matters. There is a difference between winning and refusing to lose. Winning requires possessing the tools for victory. Refusing to lose requires only the decision that you will not, under any circumstances available to you, stop. Kale had been making that decision for 12 years in a body that was not designed for this jungle and a society that had no template for what he was. And by the time the hardening pushed his agamates into formal challenge fights, the decision had become something deeper than conscious choice. It was the architecture of him. The deepest point of the 12th year was a week in the mid-season when the rains came early and kept the territory mostly confined to shelter, and Kale sat in the secondary crawl space, the same one he'd been found in, though he hadn't known that at the time. and read his parents' archives for 3 consecutive days. Not the engineering notes or the legal texts or the biological survey data he'd spent years mining for useful information. The personal records, the ones he'd been old enough to access for years and had not opened, his mother's journal. Sarah Marin had written in it every day for the 7 months between the crash and her death. The entries were not dramatic. They did not read like the records of someone living through a catastrophe, or rather, they read like what catastrophe actually looks like from the inside, which is mostly just the dailiness of it. She wrote about the treehouse construction and Joran's calculations. She wrote about the particular quality of the light through the canopy at different hours. She wrote about the sound the jungle made at night and how she had stopped being afraid of it somewhere around the 3rd week when it became familiar enough to be background rather than threat. She wrote about the food she was managing to grow in the soil containers they'd salvaged from the wreckage. She wrote about Joran. She wrote, "Jay recalibrated the water collection again this morning. He's made a mistake in the original angle calculation. He knew it immediately. He always does. And he didn't say anything about it, just fixed it. I asked him if it bothered him, making the mistake, and he said it would have bothered him more to not catch it. I think that's who he is, not the person who doesn't make mistakes, the person who finds them." She wrote near the end, "The forest is so loud at night. I have learned all of it by now. Which sounds mean something and which are just living. I think if you grow up here, you know it the way you know your own house in the dark, by the logic of it, by what things always do. I think if you grow up here, you belong to it in a way that nothing can undo." She had written that 3 weeks before she died. Cale sat in the crawl space in the rain of the 12th year and read that, and sat with it for a long time. She had been writing about a child she was going to raise in this place. She had been writing about him before he could read, before he would find it, in a language she could not know whether he would ever speak. She had been writing toward him from a place she could not see, with the patience of a person who was building something that needed to last. He had been doing the same thing, he realized. In the years of preparation, in the relay systems, and the defensive installations, and the 6 years of planning for something that hadn't arrived yet, he had been building toward a future he could not see, toward people who didn't know they needed him yet, toward a version of this world that still existed, that was still standing, that had not been erased, that was his mother. In him, the instinct to build toward. He sat with that in the crawl space while the rain ran down the outside of the walls, and when he came out 3 days later, something had changed in him that he did not have a word for in any language. Something had settled, not resolved. The tension between what he was and where he was would never fully resolve, but settled. The way a foundation settles into its load when the structure built on it is finally the right weight. Tarek Khan said nothing about the 3 days in the crawl space when Cale emerged. He merely shifted his resonance frequency to the note that meant, "You are here, I know, it is all right." Cale clicked the pattern that meant, "I know." By the time Cale was 18, he had built 12 things that the Varric had no equivalent of, survived a rock slide that killed 2 adult Varric hunters who were with him, killed a saber fang, the apex ambush predator of the deep forest, a creature that adult Varric hunters worked in groups of 6 to approach, alone, with a spear he'd built that morning, and had twice interrupted formal elder assembly proceedings to point out errors in territorial boundary, calculations that the assembly had subsequently confirmed. He was also, as Tarek Khan noted with a mixture of pride and helplessness that was new to his emotional vocabulary, impossible to tell what to do. Not defiant, not rebellious. Tarek Khan had raised Varric young. He understood defiance. This was different. Cale listened to instructions with complete attention and visible respect, asked clarifying questions, and then made his own assessment of whether the instruction represented the best available approach to the stated objective, and if it didn't, he said so. Politely, with a reason alternative, at some length if necessary. The Elder Assembly had a formal word for Varric who did this. The translation was something close to argumentative useful, and it was both a criticism and a grudging designation of status. Kara Khan, watching her son navigate the assembly with the particular combination of deference and immovable certainty that he had apparently developed at around age 9 and refined every year since, felt something that translated to pride but ran deeper than the standard Varric category. She felt recognition. She had chosen this one. When she'd found him, tiny and dark-eyed and refusing to cry in a sealed compartment surrounded by wreckage and catastrophe, she had chosen him. And watching him now, she understood that the choosing had been mutual. He had chosen this too. He had chosen the Varric, the territory, the brutal developmental gauntlet of the hardening, the status fights he couldn't win by normal means, The elder assemblies, where he was technically the least qualified creature in the room and behaved with the quiet confidence of someone who had read all the books and was waiting to see which questions came up on the test. He had chosen to be here every single day. That, Karakhan thought, was the thing that was specifically human. Not the tool-making, not the climbing, not the peculiar stubborn genius for finding the angle that physics permitted and biology hadn't thought of yet. The choosing, the daily, unremarkable, absolute decision to belong to the people he'd chosen and to do whatever that belonging required of him. She would think about this often, later, when the Dreven came back. They came back on the 18th anniversary of the Covenant's hope, not by coincidence. The Dreven were not a species that operated by coincidence. Their return was part of a systematic expansion survey, the same methodical sweep and clear process they'd been running across this sector for 6 decades, identifying habitable worlds and eliminating or displacing any populations too small to represent a meaningful military threat. Verdun 7 was on their list. It had always been on their list. The ground forces the Varric had been watching build up in the upper atmosphere for 3 months were not an invasion so much as an administrative procedure. The Dreven did not consider the Varric a meaningful military threat. This was a miscalculation, but a reasonable one given available data. The Varric were territorial, physically impressive, and highly capable within the boundaries of their established behaviors. What they were not was adaptive. The Varric had been fighting territorial conflicts with each other and with the native megafauna of Verdun 7 for 10,000 years, and their military doctrine was as deeply grooved as a canyon, formal, ritualized, built around the assumption that the enemy was working from the same playbook. They had never encountered a species that did not operate by familiar rules. Kale had spent 18 years learning what it meant to not operate by familiar rules. The Dreven ground forces made initial landfall at 4 points around the Varric territorial cluster, deploying in standard formation, suppression units on the perimeter, capture teams in the center, command unit at the highest ground position. Their equipment was calibrated for Varric biology. Acoustic suppression systems tuned to the infrasonic communication frequencies, atmospheric processors that degraded the chemical signaling compounds the Varric used for territorial marking, non-lethal immobilization technology that worked by overloading the Varric sensory plates. None of this equipment had been calibrated for a human. Kale was in the deep forest when the perimeter units hit the eastern territory boundary. He heard the acoustic suppression systems come online, not as Varric would hear them, feeling the infrasonic distortion in their chest cavities, but as what they actually were, a tight band frequency pattern targeting a specific communication range, and the sound of it made him stop on his branch 60 feet up and tilt his head. He had a very clear moment of recognition. The way you recognize a hand you've never seen before but know immediately is reaching for something of yours. He moved. The Elder Assembly was in crisis. The acoustic suppression had cut the infrasonic communication network that the Varric used for coordinated response, which meant that the clan leaders at each territory boundary were operating without real-time information about what was happening elsewhere. Tarek Han in the Central Assembly space was receiving fragmented click signal reports from runners who had physically traveled from the perimeter, slow, incomplete, arriving minutes after the situations they described had already evolved. He was trying to build a picture from fragments when KL dropped through the assembly roof opening and landed on the central platform. The assembly was not, strictly speaking, supposed to be interrupted by anyone below the third rank of elder standing, and Kale held no formal assembly rank whatsoever. This had not historically prevented him from interrupting the assembly. It was preventing him now only to the extent that the 12 elder council members present turned to look at him with expressions that combined outrage and desperate hope in a ratio that shifted visibly as he spoke. "They're using frequency suppression," Kale said, in the high-click Varric formal register that he'd been practicing since age 4. "Infrasonic band, targeted specifically at your communication range. Your runners are going to keep arriving after the information is useless. You need a different communication method," Tarek Han said. "What method?" Kale pulled a device from the bag at his side. It was a collection of salvaged electronics and carved resonance chambers and 3 components he'd built from materials he'd been accumulating for months on the quiet guess, the informed guess, the 18 years in the jungle guess, that someday something was going to come for the territory that wasn't native. The device produced sound in a frequency range that the Dreven suppression system wasn't targeting because the Dreven suppression system had been calibrated for Varric, and the sound it produced was not a Varric frequency. It was a human frequency. It was specifically the acoustic range of a human voice converted to high-amplitude signal. The Varrock couldn't produce sounds in this range. Their biology wasn't built for it, but they could hear it because their secondary optical clusters were also acoustic receptors with a broad band, receiving capability that the Driven had apparently not been thorough enough to account for. I built 7 of these, Kale said. We can run a relay communication network through frequency ranges they're not suppressing. I'll need runners, but they'll be going to fixed relay points, not carrying information. The information will travel at the speed of signal. There was a silence that lasted approximately 2 seconds, which was very short for a Varrock Elder Assembly, considering a major tactical proposal. Preth Cal, 400 years old, the observer who had watched his first challenge fight and resonated that single note of interest, said, "You planned for this." "I planned for something like this," Kale said. "Not specifically this, but yes." "How long have you been planning?" "About 6 years." Another silence, different quality. Tarakhan said, "Give the runners the devices. Tell them the relay positions." Kale told them. The first 3 hours were bad. The Driven ground forces were disciplined and well-equipped and operating on a timeline, and the Varrock response, even with the restored communication network, was delayed enough that the eastern perimeter took significant losses. Call moved through the deep forest to the eastern boundary relay, climbing in ways and at speeds that even the Varrock fighters found alarming to watch, and what he saw when he reached the perimeter assessment point was the thing he'd been carrying in the back of his mind for years, the scenario he'd planned for but hoped would never become real. The Driven were good. They were very, very good. Their technology was a generation ahead of anything the Varrock could field. Their formation discipline held under the complex conditions of the jungle environment. Their command unit was reading the battle with the practiced calm of a species that had done this 200 times on 200 worlds. They were methodical and comprehensive, and they were winning. Kale sat on his branch 60 feet up and watched them for 11 minutes and cataloged everything: the formation patterns, the response times, the equipment configurations, the specific ways the command unit was processing information, where the data was going, what decisions were being made, how quickly. He was looking for the thing that was wrong, the thing that no well-planned invasion ever completely eliminated, because no well-planned invasion was ever planned by someone who had grown up in the specific jungle they were invading. He found it in the 14th minute. The Driven command unit was positioned on elevated ground at the northern edge of the perimeter. Standard, doctrine, maximum visibility, protected position, good communication with all 4 landing points. It was a textbook command position. It was also, Kale noted, positioned next to the largest cluster of vibrant trees on the northern slope. The vibrant trees were native to Verdant 7 and had been named by the Terran Expansion Authority survey team years ago for the way they looked. Luminescent root systems, visible above ground at night. Bioluminescent sap that moved visibly under the bark in response to atmospheric pressure changes. They were beautiful. They were also, as every creature that had grown up on Verdant 7 knew, deeply destabilizing to any electromagnetic system in proximity to their root clusters when their pressure response system activated. When was the pressure response system going to activate? Kale looked at the sky, felt the humidity against his skin, smelled what the air was doing. About 3 hours. Standard weather cycle. Any native of the territory could read it. The Driven survey teams, working from remote atmospheric data, apparently had not. He clicked the relay device and sent the pattern that meant, "I need Tarakhan. I have a plan. I need 11 fighters, the fastest you have, and I need them to be willing to do something unusual." The reply came back in 40 seconds. Tarakhan says, "What is unusual?" Kale sent back the plan. There was a longer pause this time. Then, Tarakhan says 11 fighters is not enough. Kale sent, "It will be if the timing is right." Another pause. Then Tarakhan says, "Send the timing." The Driven command unit was not expecting an attack from below. This is not a failure of intelligence on their part. It is not possible to expect an attack from a vector that no one on the planet has ever used before, because no one on the planet had ever thought of it, because the physics of it required a very specific combination of a bioluminescent tree, root system, a weather event, an electromagnetic interference window of approximately 4 minutes, and a human being who had spent 6 years thinking about what an enemy would assume and what assumptions might be wrong. Kale went down through the root system of the central vibrant tree 15 minutes before the pressure response triggered. The roots went deep, 40 feet, 50 feet, interlocking with adjacent trees in the complex mycorrhizal network that made the vibrant tree clusters so electromagnetically active. He moved through the root tunnels by feel and by the particular low bioluminescence that intensified as the pressure system approached, and by 18 years of knowing how things that grew in this jungle grew and why. When the weather system hit, it hit fast. That was the nature of the pressure events on Verdant 7. They accumulated slowly and released in a burst. The vibrant tree cluster activated in a surge of electromagnetic interference that Kale felt in his teeth and his fingernails and the base of his skull, and the Driven command unit's equipment went down. Not down entirely, they had redundancies, but down enough, confused enough, that the 4-minute window opened. The 11 Varric fighters hit the perimeter from 4 directions simultaneously. Kale came up through the root system directly below the command tent. The Driven command officer was a large one, even by Driven standards, gray-scaled, quadrupedal, wearing the rank marking of a field executor, currently engaged in the process of manually resetting equipment that was not supposed to need manual resetting. It looked up from the reset panel when Kale emerged from the root system, and the look was Kale would note this later, with a quality of feeling he would take time to process properly. The look of a being that has encountered something that was not on any list, is not in any database, violates every tactical assumption that has been made about this world. The field executor was 4 feet taller than Kale. It outweighed him by 600 pounds. It had claws and scales and 4 years of command school, and the accumulated tactical doctrine of a species that had been running successful planetary suppression campaigns since before Kale's biological parents were born. Kale had a spear he'd built that morning, up in the dark in a root tunnel from materials available in a root tunnel. He also had 18 years of the jungle in his blood, and a very clear memory of a 9-year-old boy who'd looked at problems until he found the angle that physics permitted. The fight lasted 40 seconds. The field executor survived, which had been the plan. A dead field executor was a complication. A captured field executor, injured, equipment down, in the hands of a species that should by every available data point have been already neutralized, was a communication. A message to whatever analysis team was watching the operation from orbit, whatever strategic decision makers were waiting for the administrative confirmation that Verdant 7 was clear. The message was, your analysis was incomplete. It took 2 more days to fully repel the ground forces. They were not clean days. The Varric took losses that would take years to absorb, and Kale took an injury to his left shoulder in the second day's fighting that would pain him for the rest of his life when the weather changed. The Driven were not a species that abandoned operations easily, and what had begun as an administrative procedure had evolved as the field executors' capture communicated upward through their command structure into something they were having to actively recalibrate for. The recalibration was the point. A species that has to recalibrate is a species that is thinking about what they didn't know. A species that is thinking about what they didn't know is not yet landing the second wave. The window between those 2 states was the window that mattered, the window in which the Varric could consolidate, treat their injured, redistribute their fighters to the positions that had been identified as vulnerable, and make the territory into something that the Driven strategic analysis would have to look at very carefully before deciding whether Verdant 7 was worth the cost. Preth Cal, who had been directing territorial defense from the Elder Assembly with the particular calm of a 400-year-old being who had survived things that made this seem familiar, sent for Kale on the evening of the second day. She was sitting in the Elder Circle when he arrived, still the way very old Varric could be still, with the quality of geological patience, and she looked at him for a long time without resonating anything. Then she resonated the very low, very formal note that meant she was choosing words for the record. When you were young, she said, in her careful formal register clicks, you fought Korethbar. You could not win by our methods. You used your own. You did not submit. The assembly found this. She paused, searching for the precise category, difficult to classify. I know. You have spent 18 years here. You have chosen this territory. You have chosen this people. She paused again. And yet you are not Varric, not fully. You are something the classification system was not built to contain. Kale said, I know. Is this difficult for you? He thought about it. The question deserved a real answer. Sometimes, he said, less than it used to be. Prethkal resonated, a note he hadn't heard before. Not in her register, not in any register he could place. It wasn't in his index of Varric formal communication patterns. He stayed very still, listening to it, and after a moment he realized that it wasn't a word. It was the closest a Varric respiratory system could come to a human sound. It was imperfect and incomplete and deeply Varric in execution, the sound of recognition, she said. The Assembly has discussed whether to grant you formal elder-adjacent standing. We have discussed this for 3 years. We have been unable to agree on the correct classification. I know, Kale said. Tarakhan told me. I told him the classification didn't matter to me. The classification does not matter to you, but belonging matters. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said, belonging matters. Then hear this formally as record, Prethkal said. You are kin claimed by Karakhan. You are acknowledged useful argumentative by the assembly. You are known by the territory. When the Driven came, you stood between them and your people, she paused. These are the things that constitute belonging. The classification is a word. The belonging is a fact. The fact is prior. Kale sat with that for a while. Then he said the Driven will come back. Yes, they'll recalibrate. They'll come back with better equipment and more data and a clearer picture of what they're dealing with. Yes, I'll need more time to prepare for the next approach. Different approach. They'll have addressed the electromagnetic vulnerability. They'll have accounted for what happened. Yes, Prethkal said. What will you need? Kale pulled a folded piece of material from his bag. Not salvaged, he'd made this himself. From a plant fiber pressing process he'd developed at 14, covered in diagrams and notation in a script that was half Varric symbol and half something he'd invented to bridge the gap. He spread it on the assembly floor. I'll need the assembly to authorize resource allocation for construction, he said. 6 projects. 3 are defensive installations. 2 are communication upgrades. 1 is something I haven't fully worked out yet, but the materials I need are the same regardless. Prethkal looked at the diagrams for a long time. You planned for the second wave also, she said. I planned for waves 1 through 5, Kale said. After that, honestly, they either give up or bring enough that none of this matters, and I figure by then we'll have a better picture of what they're willing to spend to take a planet that's giving them this much trouble. Another long silence. Prethkal resonated the note that meant granted. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most clarifying period of Kale's life. He worked. He worked in the way he had always worked, with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that the gap between what he could do and what the situation required was a problem that yielded to time and thought and the particular willingness to try things that had no precedent. He built the defensive installations. He ran the communication upgrade. He spent 3 days on the 6th project, which he had told Prethkal was not fully worked out, and which was in fact the most important of the 6, the one that had been assembling itself in the back of his mind since the moment the Driven first pass had hit the Covenant's Hope 18 years ago. The 6th project was a signal, not a weapon, not a defense, a signal specifically, a signal in Terran Expansion Authority emergency broadcast format, using a carrier frequency that a TEA monitoring station would recognize and a content protocol that would trigger an immediate strategic review. The Terran Aspen Authority had not come looking for Verdant 7. It was not a priority world. It had been surveyed, designated habitable, not yet formally settled, which meant it did not yet have the administrative standing that triggered active monitoring. The colonists of the Covenant's Hope had been settlers going somewhere new, and when they didn't arrive, the TEA had marked them as lost and moved on. This was the way of the frontier. People were lost. The TEA had 300 worlds to administer. But if a broadcast came from Verdant 7 in the right format, if the right codes were transmitted in the right structure, and if attached to that transmission was a full data package containing 18 years of territorial survey data, Driven military doctrine observations, electromagnetic interference mapping, and a detailed strategic analysis of the planetary defense capability Kale had spent 6 years building, the TEA would come. Not out of sentiment. Not because of one lost colony ship or the child that survived it. They would come because the data package would tell them that someone had been fighting the Driven from a position of complete material disadvantage and doing it well enough that the Driven had still not achieved planetary suppression after 2 attempted operations, and that was the kind of information that a 300-world empire with its own Driven problem paid very close attention to. He transmitted on the 22nd day after the ground forces withdrew. The return signal came 11 days later. The TEA advance team arrived in a ship that was the most human thing Kale had seen since his parents' treehouse. The clean, functional aesthetic of human engineering, the specific proportions that came from a species that built for its own body, the sound of human voices over the landing communication channel. He stood on the high canopy platform he'd built in the first week of construction and watched the ship descend through the forest canopy. And he felt something that he hadn't prepared for. Not the practical problem of interfacing the TEA advance team with the Varric Elder Assembly, which was a real problem he had solutions for. Not the strategic question of how the TEA's military capability integrated with the planetary defense architecture he'd built, which was a question he'd been running in his head for 11 days. He felt, watching the ship land, like the word for what he was had finally come back to him from somewhere he'd sent it a long time ago, and wasn't sure he'd ever see again. He climbed down. The TA Advanced Team's commanding officer was a woman named Commander Lise Vara, compact, weathered, with the particular eyes of someone who had been in difficult situations long enough that nothing immediately qualified as surprising. She stepped off the landing ramp and looked at the forest around her with the careful assessment of a professional, and then she looked at Kale. He looked like what he was. 18 years in the jungle, in a body that had been pushed past its design parameters since infancy, had made him something the T officer clearly did not have a category for. He was carrying a spear he'd built, wearing a combination of salvaged, traded, and self-made materials, with the particular quality of stillness that came from having spent his entire life in a world where noise got you eaten. He had his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, and the look he gave Commander Vara was the look of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time and had decided exactly what to say. He said, "My name is Kale Marin. My parents were colonists on the Covenant's Hope. I've been here for 18 years. I've been holding this planet with the Varric since before you knew the Dreven were interested in it. I've got defensive installations, communication infrastructure, and 18 years of Dreven tactical data. You're going to need all of it, and I'm going to need your technology and your numbers. Between us, we can make this planet not worth what it would cost them to take it." Commander Vara looked at him for a long moment, then she said, "How old are you?" 18, Kale said. She processed this. "You built a planetary defense network at 18. I started at 12, Kale said. The first 6 years were mostly planning." Commander Vara turned briefly to her second officer, who had the carefully neutral expression of someone who was deciding not to have a visible reaction to this. She turned back. "The signal you sent," she said, "the data package, the tactical analysis of Dreven operational doctrine." A pause. "You learned all of this here? Alone?" "Not alone," Kale said. "The Varric have been fighting alongside me since the first wave hit. I provided the analysis and the non-standard tactics. They provided everything that required being 8 feet tall and weighing 600 pounds. There was something that might have been the beginning of a smile at the edge of Commander Vara's expression. "The Varric," she said. "They'll work with us? They'll work with me," Kale said. "I'll work with you," which is functionally the same thing, Vara said. "That's a significant claim. I've been kin claimed by the Dusk Territory clan. I hold Assembly-acknowledged useful argumentative status. I'm the one who sends the Varric the tactical analysis. So yes, it's an accurate claim." She looked at him for a long time, not processing, just looking. "Your parents," she said finally, not in an officer voice, in something quieter, "the Covenant's Hope, 18 years. They were good people," Kale said, in a voice that was steady, because he had practiced making when this subject came up, which it had, in his own internal inventory, more times than he could count. "They built something in the trees when they had nothing to build with. I've been doing the same thing ever since." In the 31st day after the ground forces withdrew, a second TE ship appeared in orbit, not a military vessel but a survey craft, running the standard assessment protocol for newly flagged contested worlds. It carried, among its crew complement, a xenobiologist named Dr. Senachok and a communications specialist named Petros Ardal and a cultural liaison officer named Yale Dunn, who had a doctorate in first contact methodology and had spent the last 12 years applying it, and who stepped off the landing ramp and immediately tripped over a root system and was saved from a significant fall by a hand that came out of nowhere. She looked up. The person who had caught her wrist was a young human male with dark eyes and a fresh cut above his left eyebrow, crouched on a branch that she was fairly certain she had not noticed until this moment, looking at her with an expression that she would later describe in her field notes as evaluating, but not unfriendly. "Thank you," she said, when she had gotten her footing. "The root system goes further than it looks," Kale said. "The bioluminescent sap makes them look shallow. They're not." She looked around. The forest around the landing clearing was vast and dense and deeply alien and doing about 40 things she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. She looked back at the young man on the branch. "You're Kale Marin," she said. "Yes, you speak standard." "My parents left a full language archive," he said. "I've spoken it since I was 4. I'm better at Varric." She processed this. "How long have you been in the tree?" "Since your ship's approach trajectory put you on the eastern landing vector," he said. "About 40 minutes. She processed this also. "Were you watching us the whole time?" "I was assessing the landing approach for vulnerabilities," he said. "You came in on the eastern vector, which is the approach the Dreven used on the second wave. I was going to flag it before your next landing. Standard Eastern approach puts you in a position where the vibrant tree root interference would take down your communications if you touch down 10 meters further north. A pause. You didn't, so it's fine. Yale Dunn, who had spent 12 years working in first contact situations and prided herself on her ability to accurately read new contact dynamics, stood in the alien forest with a root system bruise forming on her ankle and looked at this 18-year-old human who had just assessed her ship's landing approach for tactical vulnerabilities while waiting in a tree for 40 minutes, and felt something she would later describe to Commander Vara as a complete recalibration of all my professional assumptions. She said, "Would you show me around?" Kale looked at her for a moment, the evaluating look running a visible assessment, and then he said, "Yes, but stay on the paths I show you. The eastern root cluster activates on a pressure cycle and the surface destabilizes. And don't make direct sound above 90 decibels on the northern approach to the Varrock compound. The Elder Assembly meets in the morning, and the acoustic protocols require ambient below threshold approach for visiting parties." She said, "How many people have you shown around?" "You're the second," he said. Commander Vara was the first. He dropped from the branch to the ground with the easy economy of someone for whom this was a completely unremarkable thing to do, and began walking. She followed. Chalk spent 3 weeks running biological assessment on Kale, with his cooperation and with the detailed self-documentation notes he'd been keeping since age 14, which she described to Commander Vara as the most rigorous non-professional longitudinal biological self-study I have ever reviewed, with 2 methodological errors in the section on nutritional chemistry that he identified himself before I did. What she found, reduced to the standard terminology her reports required, was a human being who had been physically shaped by 18 years in an environment that exerted selection pressure no human being had ever experienced. Not changed in any fundamental way. His genetics were unambiguously Terran human. His biochemistry within normal parameters, his cognitive architecture entirely standard. But shaped, the specific musculature of extended vertical climbing, the developed visual processing pathways that had been trained on an environment where most species had superior sensory capabilities and survival depended on visual compensation, the particular neural efficiency that came from spending years solving problems with inadequate tools. The detailed write-up ran to 60 pages. The summary was shorter. She called it, "A human being who grew up taking everything seriously." Petros Ardal spent those same 3 weeks sitting with Kale in the evenings, on the canopy platform and in the communication relay stations and in the quiet of the forest, running the communications assessment that was technically his job function, and spending most of the actual time asking questions that were not on the standard assessment protocol. He was 24 and had grown up on Terran Station 9, which was a habitat approximately as far from a jungle as it was possible to be while still being technically within the same universe, and he had a quality that Kale identified early as genuine curiosity, not professional curiosity, not the data-gathering curiosity of the survey team, but the kind of curiosity that didn't know where to stop because it was actually interested. He asked about the relay system, about the vibrant trees, about Korath Bar and the hardening and the Elder Assembly, about the treehouse, about Joran Marin's engineering calculations and what it felt like to find them. He asked about the Saberfang kill at 17, the apex predator, the spear built that morning, and Kale told him about it with the flat economy of someone describing a thing that had to be done, and Petros sat with the story for a long time after. "Were you scared?" Petros asked. "Yes," Kale said, "but you did it anyway." "The alternative was it eating me," Kale said. "I preferred the other outcome." "But you made the spear that morning," Petros said. "Before you found it, you went out with the intention." Kale was quiet for a moment. The Varrock had been trying to take one for years, groups of 6, in the established formation. The formation kept failing. I thought there was a different approach. I wanted to test it. Petros said, "You went hunting the most dangerous animal in the jungle alone to test a hypothesis, more or less. You were 17. I knew the approach was sound." Petros shook his head slowly in a way that seemed to be appreciation rather than disbelief. "What did Tarakhan say when you came back?" Kale was quiet for a moment longer. "He resonated for a while," he said. "A frequency I hadn't heard from him before. I asked Karakhan about it later. She said it was the sound Varrock make when they have been wrong about something they've been certain of for a long time. He'd been certain you'd get yourself killed. Since I was about 8, he told me once." Petros looked out at the forest. "And he let you keep going anyway." "He stopped trying to stop me," Kale said, "around age 14. He told Karakhan that he had decided I was not a Varrock his age and there was no point applying the same logic." A pause. "I think that was the closest he got to saying he trusted my judgment," Petros said. That's a form of love, isn't it? Kale said, in Varric, yes. The formal word for it roughly translates as releasing authority to the trusted. It's a serious thing to extend to someone. Petros said, did he say the word formally, for the record? Kale was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally, but Cal did, in the assembly record, after the first wave. He didn't say anything else about it. Petros didn't push, but the thing between the words was there, and both of them were aware of it. And after a while, Petros said, you're going to be all right, you know. Kale looked at him. I mean that in the broadest possible sense, Petros said. Not just the tactical situation, you specifically, as a person. He paused. For whatever that's worth from someone who met you 3 weeks ago. Kale thought about it. It's worth something, he said. Thank you. The integration took weeks, and it was not smooth. The TEA advanced team had protocols for first contact with newly encountered species, and those protocols assumed a certain standard architecture. Human colonists on one side, alien entities on the other. A clear line of demarcation. Everybody sorted. The actual situation in which the human in question spoke better Varric than he did Standard, deferred to the Varric Elder Assembly on territorial decisions, had apparently fought 2 Varric challenge fights to a draw by methods that the TEA officer xenobiology specialist described as creative and alarming, and was casually working from a 17-page tactical handwritten document that the specialist could not fully parse in the first pass. The protocols did not cover this situation. Kale spent a great deal of time in the first 2 weeks serving as translator, mediator, context provider, and general organizational interface between 2 very different cultures that were trying to understand each other under time pressure. He was good at this. He had been good at this since approximately age 7, when Tara Khan had first started asking him to explain human tool logic to the Elder Assembly. And he'd discovered that explaining things you understood to people who didn't was one of his genuine pleasures. Commander Vara found him one evening on the canopy platform, which he used in the evenings for the same reason he always had. The elevated position, the full view of the territory, the specific quality of the forest at dusk that had always settled something in him that daytime kept disturbed. She sat down beside him, which was not the behavior of a commanding officer trying to maintain professional hierarchy, and which Kale noted and filed. The xenobiology team wants to run a full biological assessment, she said. They're concerned about developmental impacts, 18 years of environmental exposure that wasn't designed for human physiology. I know, Kale said. I've given them preliminary data. I've been keeping notes on my own physical development since I was 14. Of course you have. Is that concerning? Vara paused. Impressively methodical for a 14-year-old. I had questions about my own biology that no one around me could answer, Kale said, so I answered them myself, imperfectly. But the methodology is sound. Vara was quiet for a moment, looking out at the forest. The Varric Elder Assembly sent a formal communication to the ship, she said, through your relay system. I know. I wrote the template. They describe you as... She checked something on her pad. Kin claimed, assembly acknowledged, known by the territory. They say that any decision about your status or disposition is a matter of clan affairs and falls under territorial sovereignty. Yes, Kale said. You knew they would send that. I asked Prethkal to send it, yes. Vara looked at him. Why? Because the TEA's instinct is going to be to classify me as a recovered survivor and begin repatriation processing. And I need you to understand before that process gets procedurally established that I am not a survivor to be repatriated. I am a standing member of a sovereign territorial entity that is currently in a military alliance with you. Those are different classifications with different implications for how decisions about my future get made. Vara said, you're 18 years old. That is correct. You're laying out legal classification strategy to a TE commander. I learned to read at age 4, Kale said. My parents had a complete salvaged legal library. I had a lot of time. The almost smile was back at the corner of Vara's expression. What is it you actually want? Not the strategy, what do you want? He was quiet for a long moment. The forest was going to its evening sounds. The deep percussion of the large hexapods settling in the root systems, the high harmonic chatter of the canopy fauna, the particular sound the vibrant tree bioluminescence made when it began its nightly activation cycle. Not quite a sound, more a feeling of light becoming audible. I want this world to survive, he said. I want the Driven to look at Verdun 7 and decide that the cost of taking it exceeds whatever they value it at. I want the Varric to still be here in 100 years, and I want the people they are to still be the people they are. He paused. And I want to know what I am, not classified. I know the classification isn't going to fit. I want to know what I am in a way that's bigger than any classification, Vara said. That's a human question. Yes, Kale said. I know. You know a lot of things. I've had a lot of time and a reason to use it. She was quiet for a while. Then, for what it's worth, from where I'm sitting, she paused. You're Kale Marin. You're the son of Joran and Sarah Marin, colonists on the Covenant's Hope. You're kin claimed by the Dust Territory Varric clan. You've spent 18 years fighting for a world that should by every right have killed you before you were old enough to walk. And you've done it in a way that makes the TEA's entire Dreven tactical database look incomplete. She paused again. I don't know what classification covers that either. But it's not nothing. Kale looked out at the forest for a long time. I said I had a laugh like something the jungle had decided to make, he said quietly. Vara didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The Dreven came back with the third wave 47 days later. They came differently. The recalibration was visible in every aspect of the approach. Different landing points, different suppression frequencies, different formation architecture that accounted for the elevated position Varric fighting style. Equipment modifications that addressed the electromagnetic vulnerability. They had done their analysis. They were thorough. They were always thorough. What their analysis had not produced was a model for the integrated human Varric TIA defense network that Kale had spent 47 days building. From the components of all three, the Dreven suppression systems had been recalibrated for Varric infrasonic communication. Kale's relay network ran on human frequency acoustic signals. The Dreven formation architecture accounted for Varric's six-limbed fighters attacking from ground level. The TEA advanced team, 60 fighters, compact and fast and equipped with a generation of technology built by a species that had been fighting the Dreven elsewhere for 20 years, attacked from the canopy. The Dreven equipment modifications addressed the vibrant tree electromagnetic interference. Kale had spent 47 days identifying 7 other electromagnetic interference sources on Verdaneven that no Dreven survey team had cataloged because they were subtle, and reading subtle was what you developed when you grew up in a place trying to kill you. The command unit was positioned, this time, at a location that the Dreven analysis had identified as the most defensible high ground on the northern slope. Kale had spent 3 days building a listening post in the root system directly below it. The night before the third wave landed, Kale sat alone in the root tunnel beneath the northern vibrant tree cluster and did the thing he had always done before something large and dangerous. He went through it slowly in his mind from beginning to end with the particular patience that the jungle had taught him and his parents' engineering notes had reinforced. Check the structure. Find the load-bearing points. Identify what fails first and what you do when it fails. He had 17 discrete elements in the defense plan. He ran each one. 7 of them had single failure dependencies, moments where the plan required something to work, and if it didn't, the whole sequence downstream from it needed to shift. He had secondary plans for each of those 7. He had tertiary plans for 3 of them. He sat in the root tunnel with the bioluminescent sap moving slow and amber around him and thought about his father, who had built a treehouse in a jungle that had just killed everything he loved, and who had made measurements and calculated loads and built something that lasted 18 years after he was gone. He thought about the specific kind of courage it takes to build carefully in the middle of catastrophe. Not the courage of the sudden act, which is real and important, but the slower courage of continuing to work when working feels futile, of making the measurement twice because the structure matters, of refusing to build badly just because the circumstances are bad. He thought, I have been building carefully my whole life. This is just another load-bearing calculation. He came out of the root tunnel 2 hours before the Dreven ships hit the upper atmosphere and went to find Tarakan. Tarakan was where he always was in the pre-fight hours, at the clan marker at the eastern boundary, facing out, resonating at a low frequency that Kale recognized as the Varric equivalent of whatever soldiers did in quiet moments before battles. He did not stop resonating when Kale arrived. He shifted the frequency slightly, which meant, "You are here, I know. It is all right." They stood together at the boundary marker for a while. Kale said, "The plan is sound." Tarakan resonated the frequency that meant, "I know." Kale said, "There are 7 elements with single failure dependencies. I have secondaries for all of them." Tarakan, "I know," Kale said. "If the northern approach timing shifts by more than 8 minutes, the third team needs to hold the canopy line instead of pressing to the perimeter. Tell Koreth Bar." Tarakan resonated for a moment. Then, carefully, in the frequency that meant he was speaking for the record, even though there was no assembly to make it official. "You are Kale Marin. You are my son. You have been my son since Karakan brought you home, and I said you were thin and slow, and she said that she did not care." A pause. "I was wrong about the thin and slow. I was not wrong that you would need watching. I have watched you for 18 years. I am not done watching. Kale stood at the eastern boundary marker in the pre-dawn quiet of the alien jungle and felt the thing that did not have a category in either language he spoke. And he said, "I'm not done either." Tarakhan turned and walked back toward the compound to deploy his fighters. Kale stayed at the boundary for another minute. Then he went to begin the sequence. The third wave took 12 hours. Not because the defense was perfect. It wasn't perfect. There were losses. And a TA fighter named Corporal Demas, who had been 22 years old and 3 months from the end of his first deployment, would be buried on Verdant 7 in the soil he died defending, and the weight of that was not something that any successful outcome fully addressed. But at the end of 12 hours, the Driven third wave was in withdrawal, and the field executor commanding this operation had, like the first field executor before him, been captured rather than killed. Kale had been very specific with Commander Vara about the strategic value of capturing rather than killing command personnel, and the signal going back to Driven's strategic command from 2 consecutive failed planetary suppression operations on a world that their surveys had designated as low resistance was a signal that said, in the universal language of military cost-benefit analysis, this is not worth it, not yet, maybe not ever. Kale stood on the observation platform as the Driven ships broke atmosphere and watched them go. His shoulder ached where the second-day wound had been. Always would, the medic had told him. Weather-dependent? And he had a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled significantly and was going to scar, and he was deeply, bone completely tired in a way that felt like the accumulated weight of 18 years finally exhaling. Kale stood on the observation platform as the Driven ships broke atmosphere and watched them go. His shoulder ached where the second-day wound had been. Always would, the medic had told him. Weather-dependent, and he had a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled significantly and was going to scar, and he was deeply, bone completely tired in a way that felt like the accumulated weight of 18 years finally exhaling. He was alone on the platform for the first 20 minutes. He used those 20 minutes to sit with all of it. The losses, the decisions, the things that had gone according to plan, and the 3 things that hadn't, and the way he'd improvised through those 3 things, and how close it had been. The T-fighter buried in Verdant 7 soil. The 2 Varric from the second team who had not come back from the northern push. The fact that the electromagnetic window had been 9 minutes rather than 4, because the Driven had installed a secondary signal array that he hadn't known about until it activated, and 4 minutes of the 9 had been used burning through it before the window opened. He sat with all of it. He was not a person who moved quickly past the weight of things. He had learned early that things not fully sat with had a way of appearing later at inconvenient moments, heavier than when you'd set them down. He sat with the losses and the close calls and the things he would do differently, and he let them be what they were. And after 20 minutes, he put them in the place where he carried everything from which he had learned something, heavy but organized and not buried. Then Tarakhan found him. After that, Commander Vara came to the platform. After her, Karakhan. After her, Koreth Bar, who had led the third team and who climbed up to the platform with a fluid efficiency that had always been impressive, and which Kale had watched develop from the halting competitiveness of their shared hardening years into something that the military analysts on the TEA advanced team had apparently rated in their notes as extraordinary by any species standard. Koreth Bar sat down on the platform railing in the way he always sat. Balanced on 2 limbs, the other 4 relaxed, the pose of a being that was never quite off-duty because it had never fully learned how, and looked at the sky where the Driven ships had been. He said, in the high-click formal register that they had both been using since Kale had taught it to him at age 13. You said 9 minutes. I said 4, Kale said. It was 9, the secondary array. You didn't know about the secondary array. No. But you planned for a window being shorter than expected. Kale said, I always plan for things being shorter or longer than expected. The plan is the estimate. The contingency is for when the estimate is wrong. Koreth Bar resonated something low and brief that was neither formal vocabulary nor territorial marking. It was a sound that had developed over the years as a third register between them. Not quite Varric and not quite human, but recognized by both of them as meaning something specific. It meant, roughly, I see you doing the thing you always do, which is refusing to be impressed by yourself even when you've done something that warrants it. Kale said, don't. Koreth Bar said, the third team held the canopy line for 11 minutes after the timing shifted. I told them you would say it shifted and they should hold. They held. Kale was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. You could say you're glad they're alive. I'm glad you're alive, Kale said. I'm glad the whole third team is alive. I'm glad of all of it. I'm also aware that we need to run a full assessment of what the secondary array means for Draven's standard doctrine, and whether we should revise our assumptions about their installation protocols before the next wave. Kurith Bar resonated the sound that was not formal vocabulary. Kale said, "Stop that." Kurith Bar said, "When we were young and you bit me." Kale went still. "In the challenge fight, you were losing, clearly losing, and instead of submitting, you bit me." A pause. "I was angry for about a year." "I know. Then I was not angry anymore." "Then I was." He searched for the vocabulary. "I could not find the category." "I know. I still do not have the category." Kurith Bar looked at him. "But whatever it is what I have for you. It has been what I have for you since we were young. I thought you should know. For the record, since Prethkal is not here and I want it said." Kale looked at him for a long time. "I know," he said again differently. "Whatever the category is, I have the same thing for you." Kurith Bar got up from the railing and dropped from the platform, four limbs catching the branches below with the casual grace of the fully hardened, and was gone into the canopy. Kale sat on the platform in the late afternoon light of a world that was still there, that was still standing, that had not been erased. 3 days after the Draven withdrawal, before the TA Advanced Team had finished its post-operation assessment, and before Commander Vara's report was drafted, Kale went to visit his parents' treehouse. He had not been there since he was 14. He had gone once, on the day Terracon had taken him, and he had stood in the doorway and not gone in. He had not needed to at 14. The standing in the doorway had been enough. He needed to go in now. He told no one where he was going. He left before dawn and moved through the deep forest by the route he knew best. Not the shortest route, the one that used the natural elevated pathways of the deep canopy, where the branch systems interlocked and the vibrant tree root clusters created the specific electromagnetic interference that had saved them in the first wave, and which he still navigated by feel, by the current of it against his skin, the way sailors once navigated by the feel of the wind. He reached the treehouse at mid-morning. 18 years of jungle. The wood had grown moss-covered, and the vines had threaded themselves through the structure in a dozen places, and one corner of the secondary platform had partially collapsed under the weight of a root system that had expanded into and around it, and the whole thing had tilted approximately 12 degrees off its original vertical axis, as the tree it was built around had grown and shifted. It was still standing. He stood in the clearing below it for a while, then he climbed. The interior was small. He'd known it was small. He'd seen the schematics in his father's salvaged engineering notes. He'd known the dimensions, but knowing the dimensions and standing inside the dimensions were different experiences. It was smaller than he'd held it in his mind. His parents had lived in this space, which was the size of 2 sleeping compartments on a standard colony ship, with everything they owned, and they had been happy in it. He knew they had been happy because his mother's journal said so, not once but in many small ways, in the particular vocabulary of someone describing their actual life, rather than the life they'd intended. The water collection unit was still in the corner, non-functional now. The collection angles his father had miscalculated and recalculated until they were right. The salvaged equipment along the eastern wall had been mostly absorbed by the plant growth, but the structural frame was still there, still holding the shape his father had designed. The sleeping area, a platform built off the main floor to use vertical space efficiently, because his father had always thought in terms of how a structure used its available volume, was intact, the original surface material mostly gone, but the frame as sound as the day it was built. On the frame of the sleeping area, scratched into the wood in a hand he recognized from the engineering notes, was the first entry from his mother's journal, word for word. His father had read it, had written it into the structure of the place, so that it was part of the thing he'd built, so that it would last. Kale sat down on the floor of his parents' treehouse on the anniversary of the Draven's latest failed attempt to erase the world his parents had chosen and read the words his father had scratched into the wood 18 years ago. "The forest is so loud at night. I have learned all of it by now. Which sounds mean something and which are just living. I think if you grow up here, you know it the way you know your own house in the dark, by the logic of it, by what things always do. I think if you grow up here, you belong to it in a way that nothing can undo." He sat with that for a long time. Then he took the small carving tool he'd brought and added, below his father's inscription, in the mixed Verac-human script he'd developed at age 14, and which was not precisely either language, but was entirely his own. He did. He climbed down, he went home, Terracon found him there. Terracon was not, as a matter of species and personal temperament, a being who expressed strong emotion through visible physical behavior. He processed his interior states at a depth that manifested as very slight shifts in resonance frequency, perceptible only to other Varric and to Kale, who had been reading Tarakon's resonance since childhood. What Kale heard in Tarakon's frequency, standing on the observation platform with the departed Dreven ships leaving their exhaust trails across the sky, was something he didn't have a word for in either Varric or human. It was the resonance of a thing that had been guarded for a long time finally allowing itself to be put down. Tarakon said, in a formal register, words that were for the record. When you were brought to us, I said you were thin and slow and would need watching. I remember, Kale said. I was correct about the watching. You were. A pause. I was not, Tarakon said, carefully, in the formal register, for the record, correct about the thin and slow. Kale looked at him for a moment. Then he made the sound, the one his mother had described, the one that sounded like something the jungle had decided to make. And Tarakon's frequency shifted in the register that, in Varric, meant something that the translation only approximated. Something between satisfaction and completion, and the particular piece of a thing resolved. Correctly. Commander Vara's report to the TEA Strategic Command ran to 40 pages. 22 of those pages were about Kale. Not about the Planetary Defense Network, not about the Varric Alliance, not about the Dreven tactical data, though all of those featured extensively. 22 pages about the specific question of what this person was, what he represented, what the TEA's understanding of its own mission had failed to account for in its classification of frontier worlds and their surviving populations. The report noted, subject demonstrates a functional integration of two cultures that current TE doctrine does not have a model for. He is not a colonist. He is not a native. He is not a liaison officer or a cultural attaché or any other standard classification. He is a person who grew up in a specific hard place and learned everything the place had to teach him, and what it taught him was not available in any education system or training program the TEA currently operates. And further, if the question is why 2 consecutive Dreven planetary suppression operations failed on a world assessed as low resistance, the answer is not the Varric Territorial Organization, which the Dreven had thoroughly analyzed. The answer is not the TEA Advanced Team's technology, which arrived 47 days into a conflict that was already stalemated. The answer is an 18-year-old human who grew up in a jungle that wasn't built for him and built something of himself anyway, and who spent 6 years planning for an enemy that hadn't arrived yet, and who fought for a people who didn't have a classification for what he was, and who won by methods that none of the parties involved, not the Varric, not the Dreven, not the T, had encountered before. The answer is specifically human, and it is the kind of answer that the TEA, in its administrative management of 300 worlds, has apparently forgotten to expect. The report concluded, recommend that Verdant 7 be formally registered as a T-allied sovereign territory, under a co-governance model that accurately reflects the existing Varric clan authority structure and the particular status of Kale Marin within it. Recommend further that the strategic value of persons with his profile, human raised in alien territory, be assessed rather than assumed. We lost this specific data set once, on a frontier designation that we failed to monitor. I would prefer not to lose the pattern that it represents. The report took 3 months to work through the TEA Strategic Command Review process. The recommendation was approved. Kale heard the approval decision on a morning when the forest was doing the thing it did in the first hour of light. The slow escalating orchestra of waking, each layer of fauna adding its frequency to the whole until the sound was something vast and intricate and unrepeatable, different every morning, always itself. He was on the canopy platform, which he had used for 18 years as the place where he went to think, and he was thinking about his parents. He did this sometimes. He thought about his father's engineering calculations scratched on salvaged material, the particular precision of a person who believed that the right measurement made the right structure possible. He thought about his mother's description of his laugh. He thought about the treehouse, which he had visited once at 14, when Tarakon had taken him to see it and then stood back and given him the time he needed. The treehouse was still standing, damaged, moss-covered, held together in ways that defied several of Jorn Marin's engineering principles, but standing. The jungle had grown around it and through it in the way the jungle grew around everything, not destroying, incorporating, making it part of the system. Kale had stood in the doorway for a long time. He hadn't gone in. He hadn't needed to. He could feel his parents in the structure of it. The specific decisions a person makes when they're building something that needs to last, when they're building it for a child, when they're building it with the understanding that they are making a home in a place that did not prepare for them and does not particularly care whether they survive. He had understood, standing in the doorway at 14, that this was what he was. Not human exactly. not in any form that would have been recognizable to the Terran Expansion Authority or the planets that produced it, not Varek. Something the classification system hadn't been built for, because the classification system had been built before this specific convergence was possible. He was the jungle's answer to a question it hadn't meant to ask. He was the thing that happened when you gave a human child to a hard world and the world took the child seriously. He stood on the canopy platform in the morning light and heard the signal from Commander Vara's communicator that meant the approval had come through, and he looked out at the territory, his territory in the way it was his parents' treehouse. Not owned, chosen. And he felt the thing that he'd told Prethkal about. The belonging that was prior to the classification. The fact that existed before the word. Karakhan climbed up to the platform 20 minutes later. She did not ask how he was feeling about the decision. She knew how he was feeling, in the way she had always known, because she had been reading him for 18 years, with the acute perceptiveness of a mother who had learned a new kind of creature by watching it, closely enough to understand it. She sat beside him. After a while, he leaned against her shoulder, the broad, plate-armored shoulder that had been the first surface he'd ever touched in this world, when he was 13 months old and everything was catastrophe, and the enormous creature that had opened the compartment he was hiding in was the most alien thing in any universe, and he had reached out and touched it anyway. She put her arm around him. They sat like that for a while, watching the forest. The forest did not care what you were. It never had. It was simply there. Vast, complex, indifferent, and alive and ancient, running on rules it had written before any of the species currently inhabiting it existed, and which would keep running long after they were gone. Kale had learned those rules as a child. He had added his own where the gaps permitted. The jungle had taken what he was and made something of it. He thought this was, all things considered, the correct outcome. Below the platform, somewhere in the middle canopy, a Varric work team was assembling the 4th defensive installation, the one that covered the eastern approach, the one that the second wave had identified as a secondary vulnerability. He could hear them clicking to each other in the frequencies he'd known since childhood. He could hear Karethbar's distinctive resonance in the team leader position. Karethbar, who had grown through the hardening into something extraordinary and who had, over the years and the shared fighting and the gradual honest accounting that comes from being too close to death, too many times to maintain unnecessary grudges, become something that Kale did not have a Varric word for and did not have a human word for either. Something the language was going to have to grow to accommodate. Kale thought this was probably fine. Languages grew. Worlds adapted. People became things the classification systems had failed to predict. The forest was full of sound. He listened to all of it. There is a moment in any long campaign against something that wants to erase you, when the campaign stops being about survival and starts being about something else. The survival part by then has become background, still real, still requiring daily effort, still carrying the weight of the people you've lost and the decisions you made and the ones you didn't make in time. But it stops being the definition of the enterprise. Kale never had a clear moment when he could say, this is when it changed. The change had been gradual, accumulating in the way that most real things accumulate, not in a single significant event, but in the small daily decisions that added up over years became a direction. The direction was not away from the driven. It was not away from the jungle or the Varric, or the childhood of hardship and difference, and the particular loneliness of growing up somewhere that had no template for you. It was toward something. It was toward the territory, and the people and the mornings on the canopy platform and the sound of the work team below, and the weight of Karakhan's arm across his shoulders, and the memory of a treehouse that was still standing, because the people who built it to last. The Driven would come back. He knew this. The TEA's strategic analysis put a 4th wave at somewhere between 18 months and 3 years, out with probability weighting depending on Driven appetite for resource expenditure, and the strategic value they assigned Verdun 7 relative to other acquisition targets. He had 17 things left to build. He had a note from Commander Vara indicating that the TEA was sending a permanent garrison and would like to discuss long-term integrated defense architecture. He had Tarek Han's formal record of acknowledgement, which Prethkal had filed in the clan archives as a historical document. He had a shoulder that would ache in the rain. He had, somewhere in the root systems of the Vibrant Tree cluster, the spare relay components he'd built during the second wave preparation, still functional, still waiting for the next time the communication network needed to run on a frequency that the enemy hadn't thought to suppress. He had 18 years. He had the jungle in his blood. He had the particular human understanding, the understanding that was specifically irreducibly his species and his parents and his and nobody else's. That belonging is not given. It is built. The same way you build anything in a world that does not prepare for you, with whatever is available over whatever time it takes, until the structure is sound enough to last. Cale Marin, son of Yorn and Sarah, kin claimed, assembly acknowledged, known by the territory. Not a survivor, not a remnant, not a category. A person who had chosen his people and built himself into something his people needed and fought for, then with everything his biology permitted and some things it didn't, and who would keep doing it for as long as the jungle stood and the stars held, still, and the Driven kept making the miscalculation that the world below them was simpler than it looked. He made the sound his mother had described. The morning light caught in the vibrant trees below and scattered, and the forest answered in the only way it ever had. With more of itself, vast and indifferent and alive, going on, he climbed down to start work.